Welcome. Hello, everyone. On behalf of AF³IRM Los Angeles, welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Devika Shankar. I have been an organizer with AF³IRM since 2017 and one of our Los Angeles chapter co-coordinators for the past 4 years. I'm also a facilitator and consultant with Lumos Transforms, where I support individuals, communities, and organizations through embodied change and resilience building. A little bit about our organization, AF³IRM. AF³IRM is an anti-imperialist, transnational feminist, woman of color-led organization dedicated to the fight against oppression in all its forms and committed to militant movement building from the United States and effecting change through grassroots organizing, trans-ethnic alliance building, advocacy, and direct action. We were founded in 1989 by Filipinas who fled Philippine martial law and relaunched in 2010 as a transnational organization. Today, we organize for immigrant rights, against the trafficking of women and children, and against militarism in all its forms, including the police occupation of our communities and military expansion within and outside the US. We are an all-volunteer grassroots organization whose members recognize the intersectionality of our struggles and the absolute necessity of women's revolutionary struggle. Our agenda for today, we will begin with a land acknowledgement, a connecting practice, and a framing for our dialogue. After I introduce the panelists, we'll then begin our discussion with our panelists about why a free Palestine is a transnational feminist issue. And then we'll get to hear from our panelists about how to dispel and dismantle some of the myths and common arguments against a free Palestine. And we'll end by sharing some concrete actions that everyone can take. So, though we are gathered here today in this virtual space, we want to acknowledge that many of us are settled on and joining physically from traditional, ancestral, unceded, and stolen Indigenous lands. So I invite each of us to take a moment to honor, recognize, and give thanks to the Indigenous peoples who have and continue to steward the lands that we are on today, as well as to recognize and honor our own ancestors who we bring with us into this moment and into this space. To say that the genocide of the Palestinian people that we are witnessing is horrifying and heartbreaking simply does not suffice. And in this moment, we are here together to connect, to learn, to hope, to be in solidarity, and to take action. And so to get us into a place within ourselves where we can feel more connected and be more connectable, I invite you to join me, if you would like, in a brief connecting practice. This practice is offered as an invitation, and so if it's something that you don't feel like you want to join in, that is also welcome. But if you would like to join, I invite you, you can have your eyes open or closed or a soft gaze, and I invite you to just turn your attention into your body and scan your body for a sensation or a location that feels the most comfortable to you in this moment. And it might be something that feels really wonderful. It might be something that feels just neutral. It might be something that doesn't feel great, but it feels better than everything else. Whatever it is, just find that spot, something that feels better than all the rest. And I invite you to notice all the different qualities of it. Does it feel solid and grounded? Does it feel light, open, maybe spacious? Does it feel expansive? Maybe warm and yummy. Maybe it's neutral or less painful. Maybe it has a color. If that doesn't feel comfortable for you to notice the spot, I invite you to stop. But if it does feel comfortable, if you're noticing the spot that feels better than the rest, I invite you to also notice, does this help you to come into a place of more connection? More presence. And I gently want to invite you out of that practice now and just notice for yourself what may have shifted as you did that practice. And the hope is that you feel more present in this space and more connected and more connectable. So before I move into introducing our incredible panelists, I'd like to take just a few moments to frame this training and dialogue by defining transnational feminism, particularly in the way that we practice it at AF³IRM. Transnational feminism is a paradigm that is attentive to intersections among nationhood, race, gender, sexuality, and economic exploitation on a world scale in the context of imperialist globalization. It focuses on forging deep horizontal alliances between women in and beyond geographical territories. And it recognizes inequalities among different groups of women instead of overemphasizing commonalities. In AF³IRM, we define transnational feminism as coming from one or more languages, histories, or cultures. This means that as transnational women of color and women of color, we have histories rooted in occupation, colonization, and the invasion of our ancestral lands. As transnational feminists, we cannot ignore that we live in the belly of the beast, and so we must be anti-imperialist. And as anti-imperialist women who often come from immigrant communities, we work to practice a feminism that builds deeply in our local communities and horizontally across and beyond national borders, recognizing and being conscious of our differences while organizing. We acknowledge and address the role that US imperialism and global capitalism play in the subjugation of women here and worldwide. And we recognize that transnational and women of color fight legacies of colonialism and imperialism. So I'd like to now introduce these 6 amazing women who are our panelists today. So we have with us here Rana Sharif, who is a Los Angeles-born interdisciplinary scholar, educator, and social justice activist. Currently, Rana is faculty at Gender and Women's Studies at CSU Northridge while completing her PhD in Comparative Literature and Language from UCR. Her research examines the use of new media tools and technologies, including social media, digital online archives, and location-based technologies in the context of Palestine. Rana is a member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective and hosts and produces shows for the Swana Region Radio on KPFK. Welcome, Rana. We also have with us here today Riham Majeed, who is a Palestinian-American transnational feminist based in Lenape-Hoking Land, now referred to as New York City, and is the coordinator of AF³IRM New York, New Jersey. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Art History and Psychology from Fairfield University, where her research focused on challenging the exclusionary narratives within the art historical canon. As an experienced fundraiser in the nonprofit sector, Riham uses her professional skills to serve marginalized and oppressed communities. She finds solace in her passion for analog photography, finding joy in capturing moments and expressing herself through the lens. Welcome, Riham. We also have with us Thandisizwe Chimurenga, who came into media via activism, is an award-winning freelance journalist based in Los Angeles, California. She has written for New America Media, the Los Angeles Watts Times, Sentinel, and Wave newspapers, The Final Call, Black Agenda Report, Ebony, Counterpunch, Truth Out, and Daily Kos. She is a former radio reporter, producer, and co-anchor for the KPFK Evening News and Free Speech Radio News. A creator or co-creator of independent grassroots media for over 20 years, she is the author of No Doubt, The Murders of Oscar Grant, Reparations Not Yet, The Case for Reparations and Why We Must Wait, and the recently published Some of Us Are Brave, interviews and conversations with sisters on life, art, and struggle. So you should all go buy her book that is recently out. She currently hosts Root Work, Getting Down to the Roots on both KPFK and the Black Power Media platform. Welcome, Thandisizwe. Also with us today is Ihilani Lasconia, who is a Kanaka Oiwi student, artist, and organizer. from Waimanalo, Oahu, and coordinator of AF³IRM Hawaii's chapter. As a transnational feminist, Ihilani's work is centered on ending patriarchal violence through decolonization and anti-imperialism. She is currently a doctoral student at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, studying political science with the hopes of bringing Indigenous knowledge to the forefront of our education system. As a student at UH, Ihilani has been a member of the Students and Faculty for Justice in Palestine and has worked to build solidarity between Kanaka Maoli and Palestinians. As an artist, Ihilani's work is rooted in the geopolitical landscape of Hawaii and their experience being queer and Native in the 21st century. Welcome, Ihilani. Valeria Espinosa is also with us today, and she is a proud brown Chicana woman born and raised in Southeast Los Angeles. She served as the AF³IRM LA chapter coordinator from 2017 to 2019 and the AF³IRM National Program Coordinator from 2019 to 2022. Bearing the intergenerational strength of her Purechepa grandmother, she is a descendant of Indigenous insurgents. She is a fighter and survivor who comes from a long history of women who resisted patriarchy and settler colonialism. She is a student of respected Purechepa elder Tatawichi Kwakari, where she studies Kashumbekwa, the ethical and moral values of the Purechepa culture, and is learning the Purechepa language. She currently works at a public sector union in Los Angeles. Welcome, Vale. And then we also have with us here today Emilse Icandri, who is an Argentinian-born Italian. She is a socialist feminist and a member of Las Rojas, the feminist arm of Nuevo, a key socialist workers' party in Argentina. Emilse is also the press secretary of SiTraRePa, the grassroots organizing union for app-based workers in Argentina. In her role at SiTraRePa, Emilse leads her union's organizing and their fight for formal recognition by Argentina's national government. Emilse was the co-coordinator of the world's first global gig workers' congress, where representatives from 17 countries convened to ratify their first international manifesto and demands. Emilse believes that the feminist struggle is central to the working class struggle for a socialist future. Welcome, Emilse. This is just a brief introduction to everyone. You will see their full bios that have been shared in the chat, and we also are sharing a document that has all of their full bios and photos. So that's enough from me for now, and I want to now pass it over to our panelists to get to hear from them. So this first question that we're going to pose is actually a question for all of our panelists, and this question is, why should all feminists be fighting for a free Palestine right now? So I'd like to invite our panelists to come forward, and we can actually go in any order. So anyone who would like to go first, the question is, why should feminists be fighting for a free Palestine?
I'll go first. So for me, what we're witnessing is occupation and militarism. These are hyper-masculine methods of control that dignify violence, particularly gendered violence. Whether it's the state or its actors, gendered violence is leveraged to threaten women who are rising up in resistance. And in the struggle for liberation, Palestinian women have always been at the forefront as freedom fighters, organizers, caregivers, mothers. Therefore, as feminists, we must answer the call to stand in firm solidarity against the connection of patriarchy and settler colonialism.
Thank you, Vale.
I'll go next. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So as we bear witness to hundreds more murdered and buried alive in rubble on a daily basis in such a short time frame, the loss of individuals and entire family lines appear more and more as just numbers to us, normalizing a logic of war that is dangerous to be immersed in. As our oppressors use war to justify These extrajudicial mass murders, this dangerous logic that poses civilian deaths as necessary in defense of a quote unquote nation is a patriarchal and colonial framework. It further minimizes the value of women and children. So, what might struggle look like through a feminist lens? As feminists, we must learn to practice transnational solidarity that is one that transcends borders. As Chandra Mahatma aptly states in her book, Feminism Without Borders, she uses this term to stress that our most expansive and inclusive visions of feminism need to be attentive to borders while learning to transcend them. Feminism must be decolonized to move away from a Western careerist and academic practice that characterizes women as a monolith, but to one where women are defined by shared history and experiences of struggles. And as Mahatma states, what binds women together is a sociological notion of sameness of their oppression, not the assumption that women are already a constituted group. And analyzing the interactions between class, culture, religion, and other ideological frameworks will help us maintain solidarity and build alliances. All that's to say, this framework goes not just for women as a political category, but for any occupied people engaged in anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, and anti-capitalist struggle. The liberation of Palestine is everyone's issue, and our struggles are interconnected, for none of us are free until we're all free.
Thank you, Riham.
I'll go next. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here with you all. Why is a free Palestine a transnational feminist issue? Excuse me. It's our issue because white supremacist settler colonial imperialism is fighting for its life. These forces are very clear on their need to unite and work together. We must do the same. The training of New York City and other US police forces by Israeli forces within Israel, those same forces that murder our children, our people, in the streets of US cities with impunity. The monies here in the US that cannot be found to protect and heal our communities in terms of employment, social services, and medical care, because they are being funneled to prop up a murderous and genocidal settler colonial regime far, far away from our homes. That concerns us. It should concern us because we are anti-imperialism. We are against the colonization, the sense of entitlement and control, the actual theft and taking of not just land, but resources and bodies, actual people. We are anti-imperialist, just as Ida B. Wells was when she spoke against US involvement in the Philippines in 1899. We are anti-imperialist, just as Charlotta Bass was when she opposed nuclear weapons in the Korean War. We are anti-imperialist when Coretta Scott King did her peace and nuclear policy advocacy before she met her husband, Martin Luther King Jr. We are anti-imperialist, just like Shirley Graham Du Bois and her efforts to eradicate imperialism and colonialism and neocolonialism. She specifically names Palestine in a 1970 letter from Egypt, where she had gone to live after the 1966 overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah by the CIA in an independent Ghana. Of course, we also have the work of Angela Davis, June Jordan, Beverly Guy Shaftal, Barbara Ransby, and others since that time to fall back on the moral imperative that June Jordan talks about. The moral imperative talks about the law of proportionality. Israel is using a bazooka and carpet bombing to swat flies. We have to stand against that. The international human rights violations and war crimes should be enough to compel our moral compasses. What does it cost to say no, to tell our congressperson, no, you bet not? What does it cost to leave our homes and attend a demonstration in solidarity with others, to write and to speak, to use whatever our platforms are to say no? A lost job? Get another one. Some friendships? They weren't your friends anyway, make some new friends. Personal safety and security? Doxing? Keep your head on a swivel. Update and upgrade your personal security. And remember that age-old wisdom. They got to bring ass in order to get ass. Okay?
Thank you, Thandisizwe. Amazing.
I think I could go next. So one thing is our generation, it's facing for the first time in this century, this new century, an event that's as brutal as genocide. And we conceive feminism as a movement which has solidarity as one of its main principles. Las Rojas, in particular, subscribe to socialist feminism, which has a really long history and, of course, promotes the participation of women in all social struggles, especially worker struggles, and question not only this or that aspect of feminine situation, but all patriarchal and capitalist social relationships that surround and help our oppression. So we cannot look aside when an event such as genocide is happening. And that's why, for example, in Argentina, the feminist movement have just discussed that this 25th of November, on the International Day of Elimination of Violence Against Women, we're going to put that day on the service of Palestinian people and do actions around that. And of course, that we think that in order to win, because we have very big enemies, all exploited and all oppressed must join. And as socialist feminism, we fight to build an anti-capitalist and an anti-patriarchal and anti-imperialist women's movement that's independent from the states, from all capitalists, and that's capable of rising up and fighting in the streets for our rights, of course, to change also all social relationships.
I guess I can go next if that's okay. First, I want to say thank you to AF³IRM, and thank you to my co-panelists. And to answer the question, why should we all be fighting for a free Palestine? It's because it's restorative, and that's exhibited in this space, in this place right now. So thank you all for doing the work that you do, because it's affirming. All feminists should be fighting for a free Palestine, because the fight for a free Palestine is a fight for a just and free world for all of us. It is a fight against all forms of harm and violence, from imperialism, colonialism, settler colonialism, capitalism, to racism, patriarchy, xenophobia, transphobia, sexism, misogyny. The fight for a free Palestine is a decolonial fight against all the systems of power and domination that seeks to, with impunity, dispossess us from our lands, our people, and our communities. As Palestinian feminists, we recognize that the gendered violence and harm facing Palestinians in Gaza today are intimately linked to the oppression of our BIPOC communities here on Turtle Island, where I'm located. A fight for a free Palestine is one that recognizes that the systems that destroy Indigenous, Black, Brown, and immigrant communities here are central to the Zionist settler state. For example, Palestinian women in Gaza are denied access to all forms of bodily integrity. Birthing bodies are targeted by the state. Historically, they have demonized and targeted, Palestinian reproduction as a method of Zionist settler colonialism by literally cutting off generations. And in this recent ongoing onslaught against Gaza, it highlights this precisely as Israel has wiped out over 825 Palestinian families from the civil registry and continues to target women and children indiscriminately. This is linked to the legacies of genocide of Indigenous women on Turtle Island and enslaved Black women here as well. Then a fight for a free Palestine will not only decolonize, liberate, and force our return to the land of our ancestors, but we do so alongside other people of conscience, fighting imperial and colonial systems of domination. As feminists, we must commit to creating a just future for ourselves and others collectively, a future that is predicated on care and compassion. And as Palestinian feminists and a member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective, and here in community with other feminists, we're inspired by and borrow from past and present Palestinian, Arab, Black, Indigenous, and Third World feminist movements, and some were already noted by my fellow panelists, by their movements, their thought, and their practice. And because from them, we learn that the harm and violence caused to one is a harm and violence caused to us all. And in struggling for a liberated Palestine, we do so standing in solidarity with our kin all over the world, committed to a truly decolonial world, where the entire world order as we know it, the world order of power is upended by any means necessary. And this is why we fight for a free Palestine.
Thank you, Rana. I think that leaves Ihi.
I think so too. Mahalo nui, aloha kako, owa o Ihilani Lasconia. No kaneohe ame wai manalo mai au. Mahalo for having me, and thank you for these beautiful answers. I totally kako or support everything that was said. Succinctly put, the struggle for Palestine is a transnational feminist issue. One, because when we give the creation of Israel and therefore the creation of imperialism a history, we can trace it back to patriarchy. Patriarchy being the social, political, and economic system that paved the way for capitalism to exist, which paved the way for colonialism to exist, which paved the way for imperialism to exist, which is why we're in this predicament today. So the struggle for Palestine is a feminist issue because Israel is a product of patriarchy, and our struggles around the world for a deoccupied or decolonial future have to be feminist ones, because colonialism is a product of patriarchy. Like my other panelists have said, it's a transnational issue because it's so much more than what's happening between Israel or Palestine as an occupier and the occupied. But the struggle for Palestine and what happens here does set a precedent for what's possible for other Indigenous nations. And being Kanaka Maoli and being from Hawaii and fighting for a deoccupied Hawaii, we look to Palestine and other Indigenous struggles to see and create what is possible. So understanding that this transnational network that we're building, that we're fighting for, isn't just issue to issue based, but about how this legacy of colonialism connects us throughout the world. And while we're talking about colonialism, settler colonialism, all those things that that bear such grief when we say their names, it's also coming together because there's such a shared joy in fighting together, which is what I think we're also centering today. So that being said, mahalo, and let's get this show on the road. I think I was the last panelist for this question.
Thank you, Ihilani. All of our panelists have spoken so powerfully to this question about why all feminists, all people should be fighting for a free Palestine, highlighting the interconnectedness of our struggles, highlighting the fight against patriarchy, capitalism, settler colonialism, imperialism, oppression in all its forms, and also highlighting this piece about decolonial and just futures, that this is actually what we're fighting for. So I want to move now to speaking to each one of the panelists specifically to hear from you one by one, from your own particular expertise and context about how a free Palestine is a transnational feminist issue. And so I want to take this first give this first question to Rana. And this question that we have for you, Rana, is what is happening What is at stake right now in Palestine?
Thank you, Devika, for the question. I want to preface what I'm about to say and just say that it's a dire situation. So I just appreciate everyone's kindness and care as I kind of move through my notes to kind of give you a snapshot of the atrocities that we are currently facing. So we are bearing witness to an active genocide of epic proportions. And since October 7th, Israel has engaged in almost continuous aerial bombing of the Gaza Strip, introducing, as it has done in the past, brand new technologies of warfare onto the Palestinians of Gaza. And this is not unique to this moment. Gaza is a testing site for Israel's military weaponry. In the first 6 days of Israel's assault on Gaza and the Palestinian people, they dropped nearly 6,000 bombs. And this is equivalent to about a quarter of a nuclear bomb. And according to the Euromed Human Rights Monitor, Israel has dropped since October 7th, more than 25,000 tons of explosives on the Gaza Strip, which is equivalent to 2 nuclear bombs. And just to put this in context, the nuclear bomb dropped by the United States on Hiroshima during World War II was about 15,000 tons of explosives and destroyed everything within a 1-mile radius. As Israel continues to pound Gaza with its aerial assaults, as well as ground assaults, it has called for a complete siege of Gaza, cutting off all water, power, fuel, and supplies in an act of collective punishment. And as of just a couple days ago, when I updated these numbers, and the numbers have actually grown since, there have been more than 12,000 Palestinians that have been killed in Gaza, that have been martyred by direct aerial assaults. These are not including those who are dying a slow death due to the lack of access to medical attention or care or necessary medicine, or dying due to the injuries. Of those, more than 4,200 who have been killed are children. And in one day, 400 Palestinians were killed in the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza with 6 American-made unmarked bombs, each weighing 1 ton. The Baptist Hospital was a place that Palestinians in Gaza were seeking refuge. Over 500 Palestinians were killed in a single airstrike. And Israel actually denied the responsibility until several days after they attacked the hospital. As of yesterday, at least 51 journalists have been targeted and killed, and more than 3,700 Palestinians are still trapped under the rubble of their homes and buildings and aren't accounted for in the deaths. As of yesterday as well, over 28,000 Palestinians have been wounded, and more than 825 families have been erased entirely from the Gaza Civil Registry. One family was comprised of 89 members, and they have all been killed. According to Grassroots Jerusalem, 60% of those martyred in Gaza are women and children. Israel has been targeting and destroying telecommunications and internet lines and has sent Gaza into a complete blackout on numerous occasions. When blackouts occur, family members are not able to communicate with one another. Civilians are not able to call for help, for example, to get an ambulance. Journalists are not able to report on what is happening during the depths of the dark night when Israel continues its intense bombardment against the Palestinians in Gaza. Of course, the world cannot bear witness to what is happening. Israel has targeted and destroyed water sanitation, electrical grids, and sewage, as well as plumbing systems. And as of yesterday, there have been 262,000 structures destroyed. But this is not all relegated to the Gaza Strip. During this time, there has been an increase in violence against Palestinians in the West Bank as well. And it's important to know that the violence that against Palestinians in the West Bank occurred well before October 7th, and that the collective punishment against the people in Gaza has extended to exacerbated violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. And I'm just going to highlight a few things that have been happening as a result of October 7th, but preceded also October 7th as well, but with impunity since then. Reports show that at least one person is murdered each day by an Israeli settler. more than 160 Palestinians have died and been killed by settlers since October 7th. Palestinian detainees in Israeli prisons are being tortured and harassed in their cells by Israeli military personnel, and massive arrests are happening all over the West Bank without due process. The Israeli military carried out an airstrike in the West Bank, hitting a mosque in the Jenin refugee camp, and carried out another airstrike, killing 12 Palestinians in a refugee camp in Tulkarem called Nur al-Shams, and arrested at least 10. Since the start of this October 7th onslaught in Gaza, at least 13 communities have been depopulated throughout the West Bank. And I just want to underscore before I end, it's important to note that the root cause of this moment stems from over 100 years of colonial settlement, 75 years of colonial conquest, 56 years of military occupation, 30 years of blockade on Gaza, 17-year siege, and an ongoing catastrophe in Nakba that predate 1948. As a stateless refugee population, Palestinians have endured a multiplicity of wars that have destroyed homes, resulting in second, third, fourth, fifth, in some cases, 6 sites of displacement since the 1948 Nakba. And what is at stake? It is the complete erasure and genocide of a people and the continuation of our Nakba, the catastrophe that began in 1948 but has yet to end. And to that we resist. We resist our erasure, and we will not be killed quietly. Thank you.
Thank you, Rana. It's again beyond horrifying to hear the numbers, to hear the impact. And what I so appreciate is you providing this historical context for us, because so much I think of what we hear in the world is very ahistorical, right? There's this sort of idea that this all began on October 7th, and so I appreciate you for rooting us in this very long history. I want to go next to Riham. And the question that I have for you is, what are the disproportionate and or particular impacts of this apartheid and genocide on women and children?
Sure. So I'd first like to say that no one within the confines of Gaza is safe from violence, especially since its ghettoization in 2007. And regardless of gender occupation, no one is safe. And conditions speak for themselves, really. As of 2022, children made up 47% of the Gazan population, which is a striking proportion of adults to children relative to the US, where children make up 22% of the population. As Palestine continues to be in a state of apartheid, and Gaza bears the brunt of backlash from the most recent resistance effort, we know that young men and young boys fulfill the role of physically resisting or taking up whatever arms they have to protect themselves, their loved ones, and their people. Women in Gaza are not just sitting ducks waiting to be victimized. They're students, educators, caretakers, artists, organizers, farmers, and so on. And on top of that, their vital role and job of taking care of and providing sustenance for both older and younger generations, plus household responsibilities, plus childbirth, make them especially susceptible to violence. In increased times of violence, like the past 43 days, women and children are most commonly located in their domiciles or places of refuge, which include schools and hospitals. And as Israeli forces continue to bomb these very same places, women and children are bearing the brunt of the violence enacted by Israel on Gaza. The apartment complexes that were turned to rubble were filled with elders, children, and women, the women looking after them. Hospitals are filled with expectant mothers. The food insecurity for pregnant and breastfeeding women is especially impactful in the growth of their infants. The targeted attacks by Israel on civilians and their places of refuge are also causing detrimental effects to women's access to reproductive needs, As hospitals become overwhelmed with injured people, their resources are restricted and insufficient, reproductive needs are not prioritized. We have seen how this has historically been played out again and again in times of war, where men are in combat, women are displaced, women and children are displaced in mass, and food and healthcare insecurity compound. Children are not only affected in times of increased violence from their oppressors, but from birth, Gazan children are not afforded a normal childhood. They live with the constant threat of physical harm to themselves, their family, their residences, schools, houses of worship, with restricted basic needs that are arbitrarily determined by occupying forces. Now, hundreds of children have been orphaned and witnessed the brutal deaths of their loved ones. The trauma Gazan children have and will continue to bear have severe consequences on their development. And these targeted attacks are, of course, disproportionately affecting women and children as they continue to be used as weapons of war. The state of Israel is fully aware of this. I mean, in fact, we all remember the unverifiable claims of sexual violence against Israeli women and beheading of children in October. And the very fact that women and children are vulnerable in increased violence was used to misinform the West as a method to justify and further their brutality on Gazans. So our focus on the real effects of violent aggression on women and children cannot be more vital in this moment.
Thank you, Riham. And I think you've highlighted a piece that leads to our next question, which is going to be for Thandisizwe about the misinformation about the ways that we're not seeing the realities or not hearing the realities from the media. And I want to, let me just check. I think my internet might have checked out for a second. I apologize, everyone. Sorry about that. All right, I think we're back and good now. So, you know, this point that you raised, Riham, about the misinformation, about the unverifiable claims, and all of this, you know, sort of, again, erasure and hiding of the reality. And so this next question is for Thandisizwe. And this question is, why are imperialists and the corporate media striving to silence and kill Palestinian journalists and media workers in particular? And what is the role of a writer, and for women writers in particular, in these times?
What does this Zoom thing do, Hickey, telling me to do? Okay. So media is amplification. Media conveys credibility. Media conveys value and empathy, as well as its opposites. Because it is also amplification, it also conveys propaganda. Of course, we know that. But because media has the ability to change minds and policy, that is why, in addition to empathy, of course, which leads to the changing in policy, that is why it is a target. When we study history, we see the Vietnam War coverage is what led to Watergate in the first place. I've forgotten the year, but Google is our friend. When we look at the Iraq War, I forget if it was 1 or 2, the decision to ban the recording of caskets of US soldiers coming back, because the showing of US soldiers' caskets during Vietnam was also a very stark and steering moment for the US populace, right? So the same thing, and now we're banning, they are banning media coverage of the caskets coming home from the Iraq War. The desire by Bush, you have to forgive me, baby Bush number 2, I was going to say, which Bush was it? Baby Bush number 2, to bomb Al Jazeera and keep it off the air. He said this. That was one of his goals. One of his projects was to bomb it and get it off the air. Well, wait a minute. Y'all over here fighting and got armies going at each other, conflict and oil, and why are you targeting media? Isn't there something else you could be doing in this war? No, this is part of the war strategy. Just like women and children are part of a war strategy. You have to keep people, quote unquote, in the dark. Do not allow them to see what is happening. Look at what is happening now with the media's refusal, US media in particular, refusal, Western media, to call this a genocide. What is happening in Palestine is a genocide. And for some reason, the US media does not want to call it that. While at the same time, we see the weaponization of Israeli tragedy. Yes, Israelis did die on October 7th. They weren't the only ones. And did they die because the Palestinian people are just savages and barbarians who hate anyone who is not a Muslim, who does not have the religion of Islam? Or is there some history and context here that we are missing? Is this a fight for decolonization and liberation? Media is also a teacher. And so it is very important to target media. This is why imperialists and the corporate media are striving to silence media. This is why the Israeli Defense Forces knowingly target journalists. It is reprehensible, it is immoral, it is outrageous. And within a place that consistently whines about freedom of speech, i.e. the United States, you would think that there would be a much louder outcry about what is happening to journalists and the uncritical acceptance of Israeli claims about the war and the absolute condemnation of Palestinian claims about the war. The bias is glaring. And people are just walking around like, ain't no thing. It should outrage all of us. But that's the reason why it's happening.
Thank you so much, Thandisizwe. And I think this point that you made about media is a teacher, right? I think this is something that we should all keep in mind. And as you said, that it is, we should be outraged. We should be, we should be very critical of what we're hearing and seeing. I want to pose our next question to Ihilani. And this question is, why is freedom for Palestine an Indigenous freedom issue?
Right. Mahalo. I'm just going to take a second to share my screen. I have some slides prepared. Can everyone see this okay? Awesome. I'm just going to go into presenter mode. Yeah. Mahalo to the previous panelists for talking about this issue in such specific but really important ways. And it's undoubtedly like what you folks have talked about, why freedom for Palestine is Indigenous freedom issue. And like such a stark parallel that I see is this policing of language. Like Hawaii isn't allowed to articulate our occupation in ways like at our own, even at our own university or even like to the rest of the world, because we're seen as a state. The US isn't calling what's happening in Palestine a genocide, and they're also policing who can go through a genocide. The Holocaust like isn't the only time where massive amounts of people have happened. Like genocides have happened to people of color and Indigenous peoples since the start of colonization. and us not being allowed to name these violences is inherently an issue of colonization, and that use of language is so connected to this struggle for Palestine, and that's why it's also an Indigenous freedom issue. What I'll be talking about today is largely in the context of Hawaii and Palestine, speaking from this specific lens, but I think there's a lot to offer to the rest of the world in terms of framing this context. In no way am I trying to equate what's happening with the occupation of Hawaii to what's going on in Palestine, rather just trying to draw connections. So why is freedom for Palestine an Indigenous freedom issue? Well, we can look at both the occupation of Hawaii and Palestine. So in the context of Hawaii, there's huge arms and technology deals that not Kanaka Maoli, but the state of Hawaii, and by extension, the US military has with Israel. So every couple of years, there's something called RIMPAC. RIMPAC stands for Rim of the Pacific. And it's a time where a bunch of countries, Israel included, is invited to Hawaii for war games and military exercises. This is also some of the biggest times where arms deals and technology deals are traded between countries. The US and Israel specifically included in that package and on that agenda. And it's really unfortunate because this technology, specifically these weapons, bombs and other missiles, are tested in Hawaii. One of the specific locations that this is tested on is in Puakuloa, one of the largest military training grounds in Hawaii. And so what's happening in Hawaii is that our lands and our waters are being desecrated, but it doesn't just stop when it leaves our shores, because these arms and this information and this surveillance technology is being sold, backed by US dollars, to Israel to be used against Palestinians, whether it be to monitor them or actual weapons that detonate in their homelands. And so whether it's in Hawaii or it's in Palestine, US imperialism exists in both places, and our lives, because we're occupied, are so heavily oriented by militarism. Hawaii, we're occupied, we're a state of the United States of America, unwillingly so. And because of this, and because of this project, it's safe to say that Hawaii and Palestine are both settler colonial projects backed by US imperialism that seek to not just replace, but entirely erase Indigenous folks from their land, from their culture, from their stories. And an example of this is with Senator Daniel K. Inouye, one of the longest running senators in the history of the United States. He was a Japanese, quote unquote, American that fought during World War II and rose to power because of Asian settler colonialism in Hawaii. But so unfortunate because Japanese in Hawaii were subject to American occupation and American colonialism. But with Asian settler colonialism, we see folks that should be in solidarity with us, aligning themselves with our occupiers. So Daniel K. Inouye, this senator, was one of the largest, if not like the biggest supporter of Israel in the context of not just US senators, but US politicians. And he was such a staunch supporter of Israel that to date, he is not just the only US politician, but any politician with a weapons testing site and weapons named after him. So succinctly put, that's just how deeply entrenched the settler occupation of Hawaii is with the occupation of Palestine, and who gets to use like our lands and our waters, and in this current context, our tax dollars to support a genocide so far from home. Another example of how the occupation of Hawaii and Palestine are interconnected is through capitalism and white supremacy. And one of the biggest examples to date that we have is none other than Larry Ellison, a multi-billionaire, one of the richest men in the world. The Hawaiian archipelago contains many islands, but there's 8 major ones, and Larry Ellison owns, quote unquote, we're gonna get it back, one of them, Lanai. So he has complete control over this island, and he's a really close friend of Netanyahu and has hosted him multiple times, especially when Netanyahu was under deep scrutiny. He's the owner of Oracle Group. If you don't know, Oracle Group is a huge information and technology center, one of its largest home bases is in Israel. So thinking about the occupation of Hawaii, and if colonizers are able to come in and purchase entire islands to protect folks who support genocide and protecting folks who are involved in huge arms and information deals, what does that say about what Kanaka Maoli are able to consent to on our lands? And what does that say about Larry Ellison and Netanyahu, these two huge imperialists being in so close relation with one another? So thinking about how, generally speaking, militarism is so ingrained in the lives of Hawaiians and Palestinians. And it's because of these imperial projects that we're forced to engage with militarism in this way. But something that I also want to think about is the world that we build together. And it's being done right now with having these conversations. So in a deoccupied Hawaii, the US military is not welcome. Billionaires are not welcome. White supremacists are not welcome. And you can't be a billionaire without being a white supremacist, because that accumulation of capital is so heavily rooted in white supremacy. And Palestinian and Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiians, are able to build pilina, these really intentional and meaningful and intimate relationships that are unrestricted by imperialism. But beyond thinking about a deoccupied Hawaii, in a decolonial world, the world that we're fighting for, it's that Indigenous peoples are able to engage with the rest of the world on our own terms. So thinking about how nationalism is so Eurocentric that Indigenous peoples aren't able to engage with each other in the ways that we see fit. But in a decolonial world, we'll be able to build those relationships. And speaking onto that, it's non-Western nations. They don't have to align themselves with white supremacy to be recognized. So we look at the ways that smaller nations, especially nations in the Pacific, engage with the UN, and you have to align yourself with white supremacy and with Eurocentrism to even get a shrivel of recognition. And we see this in the ways in which other Pacific nations, such as Nauru, Fiji, and Tonga, sided with Israel, who didn't call for a ceasefire. And one of those reasons is that because every single one of these island nations were invited a seat and an embassy in Israel. So in a decolonial world that we fight for in a deoccupied Hawaii, Indigenous folks can engage with each other on our terms, and we don't have to have this state-to-state recognition that's so entrenched by patriarchal violence and imperialism to be able to communicate and world build with one another. And so thinking about this world building and why it's an Indigenous struggle, it's that our solidarity is forever and it will never be conditional. So as we stand for Palestinians and we fight for Palestinians, we also know that the ways in which you folks choose to fight for your lands and people is up to your own accord, and we'll do nothing but unequivocally support you in the ways you see this liberation fit. Here are just some pictures of Kanaka Maoli and Palestinian solidarity, thinking about the relationship that Kanaka Maoli and Palestinians have had to one another. It's not a relationship that's been so tightly bound by imperialism and colonialism. We've actually had a history that spans hundreds of years. So this picture to the right, if you can see it, my mouse is kind of circling it. It's a map that was created in the 1800s in the Hawaiian kingdom at Lahaina Luna. And it's a map of Palestine and the names of the waters, the rivers, the mountains in Makolala, Hawaii, or in the Hawaiian language. And this is just one of, I think, about a dozen maps. So as Kanaka Maoli, as a sovereign nation, as a kingdom, not only did we know about Palestine, but we had an intimate connection with your places so that we could articulate them in our own communities. And as Indigenous folks who had a really different relationship to imperialism at that time, we saw each other and we fought for each other in a different way. These photos right here, this one in the middle, is of Malak Matar, who's an incredible Palestinian artist. We just brought her for Decolonial November to Hawaii to talk about what was going on. Below these are some pictures of Kanaka Maoli organizers, specifically at UH, calling for a divestment of the University of Hawaii from genocide, and thinking about showing solidarity and displaying the connection between movements. There's this incredible book called Narrating Humanity by Cynthia Franklin, and she talks about movement politics from Palestine to Mauna Kea and how this solidarity does go both ways, because in our deepest struggles, especially when it comes to Mauna Kea, protecting one of our most sacred mountains, when that struggle went off in July 2019, Palestinians were some of the first people to show up. So understanding this long history of solidarity, it will be forever. Occupation and colonialism will not, but the relationships that we sustain will be for a long time. So again, why is freedom for Palestine an Indigenous freedom issue? We are genealogically connected in joy and struggle. It's not just our relationship to our oppressors or our occupiers that connect us, but knowing that we've had a relationship before experiencing this violence. Next, there's no free Hawaii, there's no free Guahan or the free Philippines, or free really anywhere else without a free Palestine. If it's happening in our homeland, it's happening in our oceans, it's happening in yours, it's happening in theirs. And last but not least, Israel is everything that the West and imperialism stands for. And to be Indigenous, not just identifying as Indigenous and thinking that it's like cool or it's like a feel-good feeling, but to be Indigenous and to act on your indigeneity is to be sharply opposed to any and all aspects of this ideology. So if you're Kanaka Maoli Native Hawaiian and you're listening today, to be Kanaka Maoli, to be Aloha Aina, a protector over this land, you have to love Hawaii just as much as you're committed to the struggle for Palestine, because a free Hawaii is not going to happen until we work together on these struggles. And though I'm speaking really in the context of Hawaii and Palestine, understanding that this is so heavily applicable to other Indigenous nations and other Indigenous territories, the way that they articulate Palestinians as being terroristic and being threats to safety are the exact same ways that they talked about Indigenous folks in the struggle to protect Mauna Kea. It's the same way that they called folks at DAPO, the Dakota Access Pipeline, terrorists and likened to jihadists. It's that same language and articulation of Indigenous folks that's being applied around the world to make our oppressors seem to be the victim, when it's really us, the protectors of our lands, of our stories and our waters, that are the ones that are trying to bring a free and full world, not just for Native peoples, but for all of humanity. Mahalo.
Thank you so much, Ihilani, for framing that for us actually in such an important way. I think not only has the conversation around Palestine been ahistorical, but it's also been through the colonial lens. And so to reframe this through the Indigenous lens, I think is a very important way to talk about and look at this. And yeah, just to highlight that Indigenous solidarity is beautiful. Thank you. Our next question is for Valeria. And this question is, why is freedom for Palestine a transnational feminist issue?
Thanks, sis. So I want to answer this question from my place in this world. A lot of folks may think, why would a Chicana from Southeast LA care about what's happening across the ocean? Well, as a member of AF³IRM, we are an anti-imperialist transnational feminist organization. We're comprised of women of color who do in fact have histories rooted in occupation, colonization, and the invasion of our ancestral homelands. As a Chicana, I understand the historical context of occupation and resistance. As someone whose ancestors have been displaced from our homelands, and the tactics of ethnic cleansing currently being enacted against our Palestinian relatives. One such tactic is associated with borders. So here in LA, we are just over 100 miles from the heavily militarized US-Mexico border. It's right here in our backyard. Therefore, we can understand and recognize the even more inhumane conditions of the apartheid border through the West Bank. Just a few years ago, LA took to the streets when it was revealed that migrant families were being separated at the border. Immigrant toddlers were being sent to court alone to appear in front of a judge. We saw this and there was outrage in my community. This inhumane treatment echoes that of Israel's apartheid system that separates Palestinian families. by denying Palestinian refugees the right to return to their homes and families, or by revoking their residency rights. So the nation building project being enacted by Israel and the history of it echoes that of here in LA, where in the late 1920s and 30s, there was a full-scale paramilitary operation of Mexican repatriation, which was essentially the expulsion of 1.8 million people of Mexican descent, most of whom were born in the US. They were rounded up in raids and deported. And the majority of those that were deported were children. So therefore, this is a transnational feminist issue, and I care about the Palestinian struggle very deeply, because I cannot stand by as my history and the history of injustice to Palestine is repeating itself right before us. Now, when we examine the most vulnerable and how we talk about women and children in relation to militarized borders, we must speak about the trauma and the tensions on women and children. 1 in 10 Palestinian women in labor are delayed in reaching hospitals because of military checkpoints. Doctors at refugee camps have been quoted in saying that fear is the most common condition of every pregnant woman. So whether it's at a Palestinian refugee camp or an ICE detention center at the US-Mexico border, women face horrific conditions when it comes to reproductive health. C-sections are held without anesthetics, hysterectomies are done to stop bleeding, and that's only a final solution after running out of medical resources. But beyond not having access to resources and reducing the chance of life, an even more violent and intentional tactic of ethnic cleansing is occurring, where Israel is enforcing the reproductive oppression of Palestinian women and enacting racist reproductive injustice upon non-white Jews in Israel, subjecting groups such as Ethiopian Jews to forced contraception and sterilization. This reproductive injustice bears similarity to a group of Latinas in Los Angeles during the 1970s who were pushed into sterilizations while giving birth at the LA County Hospital. In the name of ethnic cleansing, reproductive health and children are viewed as threats to population, or viewed as threats, so population control relies specifically on violence against women, since it is women who are the bearers of histories and languages, and therefore are targeted in order to commit genocide. So to end, I want to share a recent event AF³IRM LA was a part of. For Dia de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead, Self-Help Graphics and Art, it's a community art center in Boyle Heights, here in the east side of Los Angeles. They invited AF³IRM LA to create an ofrenda, or an altar, for their annual Day of the Dead celebration. It was held in the center of East Los Angeles, a predominantly, Latino area. And the theme was completely up to us. So we collectively decided to dedicate our ofrenda to the Palestinian women and children and all Indigenous women who were martyred defending their land and liberation. And the reason we decided on this theme is because there is a mutual history of being dispossessed of our homes and communities, where our bodies function as portals to conquer our homelands. It's through our bodies that misogynists, in tandem with the militarized state, have attempted to exterminate the legacies and future generations of our people, land, and resistance. The current settler colonial project ongoing in Palestine is deeply related to my history as a Southeast LA Chicana and many oppressed women across Turtle Island and our families' diasporas. I care as deeply about the assault on Palestinian women and children as I do about the assault on any immigrant family member of mine. Thanks.
Thank you, Vale. this is such an important point that you've brought forward around not just the mutual histories, but this piece around reproductive injustice and women's bodies being the sites of this violence, right? It's where we see it played out over and over again throughout history and across the world. So sort of now taking this into the larger global context as well, I want to bring this next question to Emilse. What is the role or importance of the global movement in defense of Palestine against the far-right sectors of the world? And what is its relationship with the global feminist movement?
Okay, so all these amazing women that came before me have clearly defined the event we are witnessing. We are facing a genocide in plain sight on the 21st century. And the definition of genocide, as Rana pointed out, is one of collective punishment. Netanyahu's government is making all Palestinians responsible for Hamas action. And the consequence of that is that we see Gaza became the 21st century Warsaw Ghetto, and that it's an historical event of magnitude that has an impact on society. But if we, at the same time, if we only analyze this part of the event, we would not have the complete picture of it. The offensive on Gaza has opened a global political crisis. We have had a first moment in which imperialism and almost all Western governments position themselves as unconditionally with Israel, right? We watch an ultra-reactionary campaign to criminalize all Palestinians as terrorists. Here in Argentina, for example, Milei, the far right, just elected government yesterday, who is also a pro-Zionist, he declared that he would move Argentinian embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in a clear provocation. But what's interesting is that as days went on, right, something else emerged. That's a movement, an international movement from the grassroots that's unconditionally defending Palestine people. And we've seen mobilizations on the Arab world, in Europe, in the US, and in all the main imperialist capitals. Protests have erupted all over, right? And I think it would be important for us to analyze, well, in which global context this is taking place. This is not a lightning, right, in a calm sky. We think it's clear we are entering and seeing a new stage on an international level. And I think this is a key to understand where we stand and which is the importance of the Free Palestine movement. Some of the symptoms of this new stage that are starting just to show up, right? We have a geopolitical crisis. That's something new because the US hegemonic domain, it's starting to crack. And that's something new. There are things that were excluded from the picture for some decades, and now they start to reappear. Remilitarization, war, nuclear danger, and also something new started to happen is that institutions are being questioned by far-right organizations. We had the Trumpist assault on the Capitol, Bolsonaro's in Brazil, assault to Brasilia. Here, well, now in Argentina, we have Milei. And we live, right, this 21st century is a world of contrast, because on one hand, you have this huge modernization, but on the other hand, you have super exploitation, genocide, oppression. Well, I think also I come from that experience. Gig economy shows this world of contrast, this offensive of capitalism really clearly. On the prior stage, the political center dominated the scene. So some people might get surprised, right? Because right now, things that look unquestionable, unthinkable, as abortion rights, democratic rights, LGBT people rights, labor rights, are being questioned by the system. And we have to know that brutality in words precedes brutality in action. So we have all these far-right governments and parties flourishing all over the world, and Netanyahu is one of them. And it must be a sign something is boiling at the core of this system, right? And behind this offensive, what's hiding is that capitalists want to eliminate the rights, the democratic rights that workers and social movements have won through the last century, the 20th century. And these far-right governments function in some way as a preventive movement, right? In case this system, more barbaric each day, start to be questioned, and is starting to be questioned. Because right now we are on this reactionary situation, but that coexists with this increasing polarization on the other hand. For example, we have these far-right governments that they deny patriarchy all over the globe. But on the other hand, we have another wave of feminism that in Argentina, in Mexico have conquered our abortion rights, and that is struggling all over the world. They told us, the system told us, that there's no more, racism is not an issue anymore. But on the other hand, Black Lives Matter has told us it's still an issue. And there's inflation, there's economical crisis, and in the pandemic, businessmen try to cut down all labor rights, right? But on the other hand, we have a renaissance on the labor movement. That's amazing. That's on the core of the most imperialist country of all, that's United States. So back to the specific role of the Free Palestine movement in this situation. There's an open debate, and this is interesting because Israel might be winning military, but starting to lose politically, thanks to this global movement. And the consequence has been that this might be the biggest eruption of an anti-colonialist movement since the Vietnam War. And in the middle of tragedy, it's crazy, but people start talking about the solution of this conflict not being military, but being politically, and then the solution is to end the apartheid and to have a free Palestine from the river to the sea, where Palestinians, Jews, and Arabs can live in peace, right? So the genocide offensive of the government, contradictory, has reopened the discussion if Israel is a legitimate state or not, right? All of these grassroots movements, I think, are an antidote against these far-right governments, and they can only push us so far, because if these movements get radicalized, could turn head down the international situation, and not only stop genocide, and conquer a ceasefire, but to reopen a discussion of a different social system that might be possible. And all these attacks to workers' rights, to women's rights, the genocide to Palestinian people are attacks of these systems that wants to increase the levels of exploitation and oppression. And it's a global attack. So therefore, we think we must give a global answer. And we think that answer is anti-capitalist and socialist movement to build a new alternative for this world. So.
Thank you, Emilse. And that I think this idea of thinking about what a different future can look like is such an important question. And I think you know, I actually want to bring in one question that we actually got in the Q&A. I want to pose this to all of our panelists before we move into our next piece, which is dismantling some of the arguments. And so if we can take just a few minutes here, if maybe a few folks want to speak to this question. From a feminist perspective, what does the future of a free Palestine look like in reference to the existing Israeli residents? Rana.
If I might just start us off. So it's a simple answer. So from the river to the sea, everyone should be free. Everyone lives with equality and justice for all. It might seem like an oversimplified response, but that is the response. It's freedom for everyone from the river to the sea. And this is not new. Palestinian Arabs, Christians, Baha'is, Jews had lived together for centuries. And so we would commit to that freedom for everyone and a just and equitable future for everyone.
Thank you, Rana. I think that answers the question. Thank you. That speaks to it perfectly. So I think now we will move into this next portion, which, you know, is to think about the fact that we are not simply advocates. We are organizers trying to build capacity to impact, to shape, and to take power for a free Palestine. Part of that is moving folks who are undecided on the issue of a ceasefire and for a truly free Palestine. And for this reason, we want to collectively make some talking points for transnational feminists, for all folks to really be able to use this by taking apart some common arguments and also some talking points that are pushed by mainstream media. So we want to sort of dispel and dismantle these. And so I want to ask our panelists to respond to some of these that we've put together. And then for what we will do as a firm is that we will put together talking points that we will send out after this webinar for folks to be able to use when these talking points are used in arguments against us in arguing for violence against Palestinians. So
for use my answers, they're gonna have a lot of cuss words in them. I don't know.
we can do some editing.
Editing, okay. Not censorship, but editing, okay.
Editing, some light editing. So for each of these statements, we'll hear from 1 to 2 panelists for each of the arguments. But if other panelists have thoughts to add, I want to invite you to jump in and to share your thoughts as well. So let's start with this, the first statement, which is Israel is just defending itself against Hamas. And so I think I'll go first to Ihi to respond to this.
Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Awesome. So when we're addressing the question of Israel is just defending itself against Hamas, the easiest not really the easiest, but something that you could respond with, even as you're learning more about this issue, is that you have to give things a history. And so a lot of times when folks say Israel is just defending itself against Hamas, they think that the conflict between Palestine and Israel and this occupation started on October 2nd or October 7th, my apologies. But you have to give this issue a history and understanding that since 1948 and arguably before, the creation of Israel has been an offensive attack on Palestinians and on Palestine for decades and decades and decades. So to say that Israel is acting out in the defense against Hamas, understand that Israel has been harming Palestinians since even before the creation of Hamas. And an excellent resource that you could plug in to talk about this issue is Noura Erakat has an incredible video called Gaza in Context. And it's anywhere between 13 to 15 minutes long. And she gives an entire historical analysis, and she really brings forth the history of Palestine, the creation of Israel, the creation of Hamas, and how these timelines don't add up. So when you're saying that Israel is just protecting itself from Hamas, it's historically inaccurate, because you have to look at all the ways in which Israel, as a settler colonial project since its inception, has been an attack on Palestine and Palestinians. So succinctly put, for folks to say Israel is just defending itself against Hamas, this is a war, understanding that Israel has been attacking Palestine since before Hamas was even created. And what happened and this conflict didn't just start on October 7th, but it's been a long history and a legacy of colonialism and imperialism. And Israel is justifying all of its violence by portraying itself to be the victim when it's really the oppressor. And hopefully in these talking points, we can kind of cut that down. That was, I understand, a bit much, but succinctly put, you have to give everything a history, give Palestine a history, give Israel a history. And from there, and I think it is applicable to a lot of other questions we'll be addressing, once you know the true history of these places and how one is like born out of imperialism and another is born out of love for land and people, the arguments that Israel and the IDF make seemingly fall apart. You can respond, maybe in a slower tone, maybe with more swear words if you like, but yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Ihi. Emilse, did you want to respond to this statement as well?
Yeah, I think this argument is not new. For Zionists, every action the IDF takes is either defensive or preventive, right? So because this idea of war is wrong, but because what is a war? Two armies in equal condition fighting for a territory, right? But that's not the situation in Gaza. We have a colonizer and oppressor state that's been occupying Palestinian land and resources for 75 years, a state that has broken all international agreements with the help of imperialist governments and built the biggest prison on open air, where they systematically try to eradicate Palestinian people. So there's no equality of terms between oppressor and oppressed. And on the other side, as Ihi said, Zionists want to sell the idea that people was living peacefully till October 7th. But things didn't start on October 7th. And we don't have to go back to Nakba. We could go back just to July of this year, where Jenin ethnic cleansing, right? Or maybe what happened in June in the West Bank. Or maybe May, where Zionists marched into Jerusalem. Choose your month. So when you oppress people and get them in ghettos and force them into submission and the whole life of blood and mud, it's really hard for something to get out of it something different of blood and mud. And the other element to dismantle is the claim that Hamas is a terrorist organization. We, Las Rojas, reject this claim. Hamas won elections on 2006 just because was the only party who raised up the program of a unified Palestine. And even if we don't share Hamas methods, politics, or program, we consider they should be mobilizing Palestine like in Intifada. We don't use guerrilla tactics. But even if we don't share the methods, that's a subordinate aspect of the discussion, because what we face is genocide, and we are unconditionally in the face of the right of Palestinians to resist colonization, occupation, and apartheid.
Thank you, Emilse. I want to move to our next statement to dismantle. So let's dismantle this one. Israel is the US's ally. We have to defend Israel. Vale, would you like to speak to this one?
Yeah. And I'm sorry, it's just my first initial reaction to that statement is, I don't even defend the US, so why would I defend an ally of the US, right? But, you know, it's interesting. You know, the US rationalizes the invasion of countries in the name of bringing democracy, right, to countries that the US perceives as like morally inferior or lawless or something like that. And it's interesting, you know, that Israel does a really good job of their false propaganda, and they like to represent themselves as the most socially democratic, you know, in that region. So because of that, you know, there's this, because of that, the overt suppression of Palestine is justified in that same rationale. So we have to be really critical of that and really think about, you know, why, you know, this narrative of, you know, bringing democracy, or, you know, Israel is, you know, the morally, you know, superior one. We have to be really critical of that narrative.
Thank you, Vale. Is there any another panelist who wants to respond to this one?
Could I jump in just briefly?
Yeah.
So kind of going up what Vale talked about, the US isn't even an ally to its own constituents and its own citizens. Unless you're in the top 1%, or unless like you're wealthy, the US isn't coming to your aid. And an example of this that we can connect in Hawaii is an entire town on Maui burned down, Lahaina. And it's been incredibly hard to get any aid federally or even from the state. But when it comes to US aid for allies such as Israel, Hawaii as a state pledged $13 million in tax dollars at the drop of a hat. So thinking about, as an American, as a US citizen, US being an allyship with Israel is to your own detriment. The US funding imperialism abroad is the reason why you don't have access to higher education. It's the reason why you don't have access to healthcare. So thinking about how imperialism isn't good for anyone. And if you're an American living in the heart of empire, it still isn't good for you. So everyone's harmed by this, not just folks on the periphery of empire, but those in the center of it as well.
Thank you, Ihi. I'd like to move to the next statement, the next argument that we'd like to dismantle, which is that Palestine was given a chance for peace, but chose violence against Israel. Riham, would you like to respond to this one?
Yeah. So, you know, Zionism in its nature, as my co-panelists have been saying as well, it is a settler colonial movement. It was predicated on a lie, with their slogan being a land without people for people without land, when in reality they knew very well that a native population existed and a voluntary exodus would not occur, that they had to remove them forcibly to make use of quote unquote civilized use of land. In the early 20th century, when the early Jewish settlers with a Zionist agenda arrived, the Yishuv, they did not seek to establish settlers as equal. They did not want a partition state. They saw Palestinian Arabs as inferior and sought to dominate them. Ben Gurion himself, the primary founder of the State of Israel, the first prime minister of the State of Israel, stated that any accepted partition plan, whether it be the UN's or otherwise, would be temporary. He said, and I quote, "I don't regard a state in part of Palestine as the final aim of Zionism, but as a mean toward that aim." In any case, why should Palestinians accept a partition plan for foreigners to come in and own over 50% of their land? And that was at the time. That was in the early 20th century. I also want to point out that like Rana said, there was an existing Jewish population that coexisted with the rest of with other religious factions, Christians, Muslims. But I'm referring to the Yishuv, who, like I said earlier, were foreigners to the land. They were new settlers. At every onset of the conflict or of the aggression, the state of Israel flipped the narrative to portray Arabs as the aggressors, and as they as defending themselves. This claim was even made after the Deir Yassin massacre during the Nakba, in which Deir Yassin, like a number of other Palestinian villages, signed a non-aggression pact with the Yishuv, but was brutally ethnically cleansed anyway. And one of Israel's greatest propaganda campaigns, besides this one, was the revisionism of the 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel launched an attack on Egypt's Air Force, claiming it was preemptive self-defense, when really they sought this attack to maximize territorial gain, as they subsequently did conquer Gaza and the West Bank. One last thing in regards to the Oslo Accords, which is also a big talking point. The discussions pertain to whether Palestinians can regain control over 20% of the land conquered in 1967. The land taken in 1948 was not even on the table. So why should Palestinians accept this diminutive offer of peace, which would not allow the return of 700,000 displaced Palestinians and their subsequent generations, and not likely change the material conditions anyway?
Thank you, Riham. I'll pass it now to Rana to respond to this one as well.
Thank you so much, Riham, for that. And there's no choice in violence. So I just want to underscore that. So assuming that there's a choice to choose violence or to not choose violence assumes that Palestinians have a choice. I think it's really important, and other folks have said this throughout our conversation, is that there's like a certain form of amnesia where history began on October 7th, and we don't think about anything that's happened before that. So I just want to affirm that in order for choice to exist, one would have to assume a lot of privileges and assume that this is asymmetrical, the conditions of a settler colonial nation state as an occupier. And with respect to Hamas and armed resistance, so that is actually enshrined in the United Nations Declaration, which is really interesting because those rules tend to be applied to certain communities and not others. And Palestinians somehow are exempt from, applying their legally enshrined right to protect itself. And affirms, and I just want to say it's Resolution 3246, which affirms the legitimacy of armed resistance by oppressed people in pursuit of the right to self-determination, and condemns governments which do not support that right. But putting violence, armed resistance aside, I do want to say that since before the 1948 Nakba, and ever since, Palestinians have engaged in endless appeals to international community, letter writing campaigns, petitions, diplomatic appeals, boycotts, picketing, strikes, popular protests, cultural narrative making work, and much more. All along, Palestinians were actively silenced and ignored by the international community and met with military force by the Israeli regime, in fact. In Gaza alone, just in 2018, Palestinians in the Gaza Strip turned out in record-breaking numbers in nonviolent protests during the Great March of Return, commemorating the 70th anniversary of the 1948 Nakba. They were shot, and with bone-shattering shrapnel, their lives were stolen. Nearly 200 Palestinians were martyred, and permanent injuries were caused to nearly 13,000 people, most of whom were youth. So Palestinian armed resistance, which is typically framed as an unprovoked form of terrorism, is often taken out of context, removed from a larger history of Palestinian struggle for freedom, from ongoing settler violence. So I just wanted to kind of bookmark that and to kind of, again, locate this one choice, assume something that we should not be assuming. And two, to say that one, armed resistance within this particular context is enshrined and protected legally in international human rights law, United Nations law. And then also that Palestinians have used every arsenal at their disposal. And we are where we are. So thank you. I just wanted to add that.
Thank you so much, Rana. Let's move to our next statement to dismantle. Being against the state of Israel is anti-Semitic. Thandisizwe, I'd like to go to you first for this one.
Being against the state of Israel is anti-Semitic. There is a caucasity, a specific type of Caucasian audacity in equating anti-Semitism with the Zionist state of Israel. And by that, I mean the white supremacist imperative centering of specifically Western European and United States Jews as the end all be all of things Jewish or Jewry. Is it anti-Semitic when Orthodox religious Jews, such as the Hasidim, loudly criticize Israel for what it is doing? Is it not anti-Semitic when these same Western European and United States Jews discriminate against and brutalize Ethiopian and Sephardic Hebrew peoples? Is it not anti-Semitic when Western European and United States Jews brutalize and murder Palestinian Christians, not because they are Christian, but because they are Palestinian? The reality is this: just like what we are witnessing right now is an at least 75-year-old land grab, labeling critique and condemnation of the Zionist state of Israel anti-Semitic is part and parcel of this same imperialist project, because it is an attempted narrative and morality grab. It is an attempted narrative and morality grab to coincide with the vicious land grab of this settler colonial project to create support for it. Political and financial support for the having of a white supremacist outpost in this area of the world, which is quote unquote hostile to United States interests. But the world continues to say, we ain't having it, because we ain't. And by the way, we are leaving out the major argument for justification, which is religious, that because we are the Jews or we are God's chosen people, we have this right. Religions have always been used to justify rape, pillage, murder, and conquest. And I want to turn our attention to The Guardian online, May of 2017. I'm sorry, I don't happen to have the date. Hamas released their new charter in which they state, and I quote, Hamas affirms that its conflict is with the Zionist project, not with the Jews, because of their religion. Hamas does not wage a struggle against the Jews because they are Jewish, but wages a struggle against the Zionists who occupy Palestine. Yet it is the Zionists who constantly identify Judaism and the Jews with their own colonial project and illegal entity, unquote. That's what Hamas has said. So just as a corollary to when you hear, criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic, well, you know, Hamas just wants to kill Jews. No, they don't. They said it back in 2017. So in addition to that first one, stop parroting this one also.
Thank you, Thandi. I think we have two more statements to dismantle. And so I think what I'll do is I'll move to the next one just to make sure that we have time to really pull each one of them apart. The next statement that the next argument that we would like to dismantle is Palestine or Hamas is kidnapping and terrorizing Israelis. Rana, would you like to respond to this one?
Sure. I mean, I'll be brief. Quite frankly, I mean, I think that anyone that's been paying attention closely to the media has learned that Israel is really good at manufacturing a certain narrative. And by accepting that, we're accepting a dominant narrative that is exceedingly problematic and damaging, in fact, and actually violent in and of itself. So I think that by suggesting that, Hamas is kidnapping and terrorizing Israelis, I think what I would encourage folks to do is to go back and look at the videos and the interviews with those who have been released by Hamas and allow their stories to hold true on their own. Because I do think that by encouraging folks to actually do some research and to see what is happening and what is being done, you will not only see what folks are saying, they are being released. There were a few folks who had been released and did hold press conferences. So we can learn from their experiences directly how they were treated. And I think that that's really powerful, because then you could take that information and actually say that is this meta narrative that is trying to be pushed on folks that they are doing X or Y or Z can be challenged. And you're actually seeing within Israeli communities pushing back against the fact that they don't even want to let their own people speak up about what their experiences have been. So I would just encourage folks very simply to actually just look at the conversations, let the people speak for themselves, and let that be what in fact drives what will dispel actually this kind of framing.
Thank you, Rana. And finally, the last statement that we'd like to dismantle today is Hamas is hiding under Gaza's hospitals and schools. Thandi, would you like to speak to this one first?
I sure would. Where's the evidence for this? Why are the statements that come from Israel automatically, without question, accepted as true, and those from Palestinians condemned automatically as false? The November 15th edition of the New Republic asked the question, what do the journalists and media workers who are embedded within the Israeli military on these campaigns say? When we talk about the evidence, do you have media organizations embedded with you, as we have seen in other wars? This has just begun as a reaction or as a result of October 7th. Now we're seeing mainstream media organizations embed with the Israeli Defense Force. However, as a condition to enter Gaza under IDF escort, outlets have to submit all materials and footage to the Israeli military for review prior to publication. Journalists embedded with the IDF in Gaza operate under the observation of Israeli commanders in the field and are not permitted to move unaccompanied within the Strip. Again, that's from the New Republic, November 15th edition. Another quote, the pitfalls of embedding with the military, journalists being unarmed and usually lacking in formal military training, depend entirely on their handlers for security. So it stands to reason that they'd hesitate to report anything negative about the people on whom their lives quite literally depend. It's very hard to have an objective, clear-eyed view of people who are protecting your life. Quoting one reporter, your attempt at objectivity will be eroded even if you're not aware of it. And objectivity, that's another, just a firm discussion for another day. But anyway, it makes embedded journalists susceptible to legitimizing the military's view of the conflict. So these are the kinds of questions that we not only need to have as individuals and in one-on-ones, these are the kinds of questions we need to demand of the media that we consume. Let's say, for example, let's say that Hamas is hiding under Gaza's hospitals and schools. How many of them are there? Is the number of Hamas fighters and soldiers and armed combatants who are hiding under Gaza's hospitals and schools, is it equal to or greater than the number of unarmed civilians, children, the elderly, pregnant women, neonatal intensive care unit babies, and all others seeking medical attention and shelter in these hospitals and schools? No? Then why are you bombing these sites? Because your mission is to murder Palestinians in order to remove their presence from Palestine. That's why. That's all I got.
Thank you, Thandi. And I think that that closes this portion up just really perfectly. As I mentioned, we will be sending out something to all of the registrants that will include a toolkit that will have all of these statements dismantled with what each of our panelists have brought forward. So you will get that as a toolkit along with the Palestinian Feminist Collective toolkit, which is comprehensive. So I want to
if I just real quick want to send a shout out to Black women radicals who held a panel discussion about a month ago. You can check the video on YouTube. They have also put together a resource list documenting Black radical feminists and just Black radical in general support of Palestine. Lots of historical contextual readings that you can use to include in your toolkit. So I want to send a shout out to the Black women radicals.
Thank you so much. And we could include that when we send out that follow-up. Thank you. So in this last piece, I want to bring it back to what are some concrete actions we can take to support a free Palestine. We follow the lead of women like Rana and the Palestinian Feminist Collective. And so we want to ask you directly, what are some concrete things that folks can do from wherever they're at to end the bombing of Palestine?
Thank you for the question. And perhaps what I'll do, and I know that our PFC toolkit will be circulated. So, and Black radical women, I got to see that. So I think that that information will be really powerful for folks to have in hand. So I'll just name a few things for ways that folks can get involved. So join local actions and connecting with local organizations in your area. So there's the Palestinian Youth Movement, Samidun, Jewish Voices for Peace, Not in Our Name, U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, the Al-Auda Right to Return Coalition. There's Palestiniat, for example, in Seattle, the Arab Resource and Organizing Center in San Francisco, and of course, the Palestinian Feminist Collective. So get in touch with one of the organizations, Palestinian organizations that are doing work on the ground, and join them. Another is for those of us who are on Turtle Island and have representatives, to contact your representatives, and this is true of other places as well. Contact your representatives and make 3 clear demands. One is stop the genocide, demand an immediate ceasefire and an opening of a humanitarian corridor to the Gaza Strip, not a pause, a stop the genocide and an immediate ceasefire, not like a few hours out of the day kind of pause, no, an immediate ceasefire and an opening of a humanitarian corridor to the Gaza Strip. 2 is to end U.S. aid to Israel and all U.S. aid to Israel and nullify all joint U.S.-Israeli agreements and collaboration in armed trade and policing. Those have damages in Palestine and to our local communities as well. And then number 3 is demand a free Palestine, end the siege and occupation and grant Palestinians their full rights and freedom, including the right of refugees to return to our ancestral land. I would also encourage folks to learn more and participate in BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And we learned of the power of BDS in South Africa, and it is undoubtedly an extremely powerful tool. And I would direct folks to bdsmovement.net to learn more about BDS. And then finally, for us and myself as a member of the PFC, we continue to educate, agitate, and organize, first ourselves, as well as our kin and community. We join communities across the nation, across the world, and demand an end to this genocide, to lift the siege on Gaza and the military occupation, support the full social, political, and economic rights and freedoms of Palestinians, implement the refugee right of return, end the desecration of our sacred sites and all U.S. aid to the Israeli regime, and demand that our governments invest that money in education of our youth, access to healthcare, jobs, and housing here in the United States, support BDS, and finally stop censorship and the criminalization of those who are brave enough to stand up for Palestine. So those are just a few ways that I can encourage our guests to get connected.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rana. I want to now, as we move into this close, just invite our panelists to share any closing words, just brief closing words and or a call to action. And so I'll pass it first to Emilse to share any closing thoughts and any calls to action that you may have.
Yeah, I think this idea, right, of this polarized world, and that we have to make grow this movement, because the movement to free Palestine, it's growing and it's getting bigger, and we have to work on it. So any kind of actions we start doing and participating are really important, and is a statement we had to defend. For example, us in the universities, in the public universities, we are taking this campaign, painting Palestinian flags, and we have to be really calm, because Zionists come and attack your posters, attack your flags. They say you are anti-Semitism, and you have to be really calm down and do not go into any kind of provocations and get that flag out of there. And we in Argentina, particularly, we are doing this 24th of November in the frame of the International Day to Eliminate Violence Against Women and Diversity. We are dedicating it to the Palestinian woman and the Palestinian people and for their liberation. And Las Rojas are going to make a caravan, like a kind of route, where we are going to put posters in all main routes of the city to visualize what's going on and to free Palestine.
Thank you, Emilse. Thandisizwe, any closing thoughts or calls to action that you want to offer?
Yeah, the tide is turning. I think it will continue to turn. The LA Times recently, in their editorial, called for a ceasefire. Waiting on the New York Times. We're looking at you, Washington Post and New York Times. Does it matter that that's quote unquote a liberal reformist call? Not necessarily, considering that you have bloodthirsty ghouls chanting no ceasefire, that children, women are absolutely being targeted, journalists are being targeted, and the U.S. mainstream media has openly aided and abetted genocide. That is the absolute minimum, is to call for a ceasefire. Of course, there should be an end to the occupation. Of course, the Palestinian people should have their land returned to them. Of course, we make these calls at the same time we say a ceasefire and everything else that Rana said. Keep up the pressure and keep up the work.
Thank you so much. Rana, are there any other closing words and calls to actions that you would like to offer?
I just want to share some gratitude. Thank you for being in this space. And I think that we can all commit to standing alongside one another to free Palestine and to support one another in the work that we have ahead, to really push back against the colonial and imperial powers that would actually pit us against one another, that would actually divide us, to attempt to conquer more. but to find care and compassion and community in one another to ultimately fight for a free Palestine.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Before I hand it over to our AF³IRM panelists specifically, I want to also remind folks that that exercise that we did of dismantling the lies that we hear, that the panelists engaged in, will explicitly be turned into organizing talking points that folks can use, and that's going to be emailed to you all, along with all the other resources that the speakers referred to. So now I want to go to our AF³IRM speakers to just really briefly share any calls to action. I know there's a lot of local things that our chapters are doing for this next sort of few weeks. And so we want to call attention to that in connection to 60 days of against violence against women. So I'll hand it over first to Riham to talk about what's happening in New York.
Thanks, Devika. Yeah, so the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence is an international campaign, and every year, including this year, AF³IRM New York, New Jersey, ALTER features photographs and stories of missing, murdered, and trafficked women. Our objective is to call attention to the relentless war on women, their commoditization, which often leads to their demise, and the non-concern by the greater part of humanity as our sisters are decimated under various pretexts the world over, especially now, Palestinian women. This year, our altar is on December 16th, which does technically fall outside the day of the 16 days, but it is on December 16th. I hope you will join us. Yeah, I'll pass it off to our next sister.
Thank you. We'll go next to Ihilani.
Mahalo. So AF³IRM Hawaii will be hosting a movie night. The date is to be determined, as well as the venue, but it should be coming up within the next couple of weeks. We'll be screening Gaza in context, breaking down that film, and really just getting more into the weeds of dismantling all these arguments for imperialism and for Zionism. If you could follow AF³IRM Hawaii on our Instagram, we'll have more updates there. We know that such an integral part of doing movement work, of doing organizing, is what sustains you on this journey within these actions. AF³IRM Hawaii is privileged enough to have a lo'i, or a taro patch, that we've been growing food on to help us feed ourselves while we organize. So if you're interested in getting involved in being on land, being on Aina, we'll have more updates for that as well. Mahalo.
Thank you. And then to Vale.
Yeah, so a couple of things coming up. The first is we're going to have an art build. So essentially, we're just going to be coming together to, make flags, stencils and things like that. We want to make sure we incorporate, art in our resistance as well, right? The role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. So we want to always make sure we include the arts, in our fight for liberation as well. So that'll be coming up on Wednesday. And then on Saturday, there is a Children's March for Palestine as well. On our Instagram page, we'll definitely post, more information on that. But, I just want to, note as well that, locally we've been following the leads of like Palestinian Youth Movement and all of the local Palestinian orgs. And every time, I think since the first time they put out the call to action, AF³IRM has mobilized every week since then. So this is just our continued, mobilization and standing in solidarity.
Thank you so much, Vale. And yes, so this has been across all of the cities that we have chapters in, and we will continue to be mobilized in this way until a full ceasefire is implemented. A couple of other things I want to highlight for some of our chapters that were not featured here on the panel. So in San Diego, there are also going to be some events and some actions. So on Friday, November 24th, there will be an art build which will lead to Wednesday, November 29th. There will be a banner drop on the International Day of Solidarity with Palestine. And in Boston, on November 23rd, on the National Day of Mourning, there will be an action from Turtle Island to Palestine, Colonialism is a Crime. So if you are in any of these areas, we really encourage you to find us and to join us. So on behalf of AF³IRM Los Angeles, I want to thank each of the panelists for sharing with us your time, your knowledge, your expertise, and for helping to equip us with the tools to articulate why freedom for Palestine is a transnational feminist issue and to take action. And to our audience, I want to thank you all for your time and for joining this virtual event. We hope that for some of you, this training is only the beginning, and we really encourage all of you to get organized and to join us in the ongoing fight. As we mentioned, the resources, the dismantling exercise, all of that will be emailed to you. There is a link in the chat as well for a Google form. If you're a woman of color, especially interested in joining AF³IRM, please fill out that form. If you're interested in joining one of our actions, let us know and we'll reach out to you. We really want to support folks in getting mobilized, and so just know that wherever you are, you can find us. We're here and we're continuing to mobilize. So thank you again. And just to close us out, I want to hand it back over to Rana to close us out with a chant. Rana will lead us, and then for the other panelists, we can come off mute as well and respond to the chant as Rana leads us.
Thank you so much, everyone. So let's finish it out strong. Let's free Palestine.
Free
Palestine. Free Palestine. Free Palestine. Thank you so much.
By any means necessary.
By any means. From the river to the sea. Thank you so much.
Ashe.
Everyone.
Thank you. It's been an honor.
Thank you.
Thank you.